Pop culture loves the idea of the 300 Spartans, muscle-bound men fighting shirtless in slow motion, executing a suicidal last stand against millions. That concept of a glorious, isolated sacrifice is literally enshrined in stone at the actual pass of Thermopylae today. But the historical record reveals a different event. The story we usually hear is the product of a deliberate distortion, known to historians as le mirage spartiate, the Spartan mirage. This narrative framework exaggerates Spartan discipline and militarism. It papers over the strict social hierarchy and the practical limitations of their actual military capabilities. To understand what happened in 480 BCE, we have to examine the massive naval battle fighting at the exact same time, the heavy bronze armor the Greeks wore to survive, and the dark reasons this ancient myth was resurrected centuries later. The legend of the 300 was a carefully engineered narrative, designed to mask a strategic failure and eventually to fuel one of the deadliest ideologies of the 20th century. The defense against the Persian invasion relied on a combined land and sea operation, masterminded by the Athenian general Themistocles. The strategy required holding two bottlenecks at once: land forces blocking the pass of Thermopylae, while the allied Greek fleet held the adjacent straits of Artemisium. The Greeks committed 271 triremes. If the Persians broke through here, they could land troops behind the Spartans. This is a scale model of a trireme, the primary Greek naval weapon. It relied on banks of oarsmen to drive a bronze-clad ram directly into the hulls of enemy vessels. The Persians tried to bypass this naval blockade by sending a detachment around Euboea. Instead, they sailed directly into a summer gale that violently shredded the entire Persian fleet against the rocks. The land and sea fronts were completely codependent. Without the struggle in the water at Artemisium preventing a sea flank, the Greek position on land would have fallen on day one. Back on land, the narrow geography of the Hot Gates perfectly suited the fighting style of the heavily armed Greek infantrymen, the hoplite. Artifacts like this black figure vase show the hoplites' equipment: heavy bronze breastplates, greaves, and Corinthian helmets. They locked together their large wooden shields, the aspis, to form an overlapping phalanx wall. The Persian infantry, depicted in this stone relief, were equipped for a different style of war. They relied on mass archery, wicker shields, and quilted linen armor. Pinned between the mountains and the sea, the Persians couldn't deploy their superior numbers or their cavalry. The Greeks forced them into a grinding, head-on collision against a bronze wall. The Greek line held for 2 days. The strategy collapsed only when a local man named Ephialtes showed the Persians a mountain path that allowed them to bypass the bottleneck and encircle the defenders. Leonidas remained in the pass to conduct a tactical rearguard action. His force stayed behind to buy time for the retreating main army and the fleet to escape the encirclement. The final morning at Thermopylae was a pragmatic maneuver designed to salvage a strategic failure. To soften the blow of losing central Greece, the Greeks immediately reframed the defeat as a moral victory. The poet Simonides penned an epitaph for the fallen, writing, "Stranger, bear word to the Spartans that we lie here obedient to their laws." That sentiment, obedience unto death, was highly attractive to fascist regimes thousands of years later. Nazi educators drilled the Thermopylae myth into their youth academies to breed unquestioning loyalty to the state. The most lethal application of this propaganda arrived in the winter of 1943, as the German Sixth Army faced annihilation at Stalingrad. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring broadcast a speech across Germany. He directly compared the soldiers at Stalingrad to Leonidas and his 300, quoting Simonides' epitaph to frame their destruction as a glorious duty. This archival photograph of the ruined Stalingrad skyline shows the reality of that decision. The Sixth Army was starving and entirely abandoned by a leadership that refused to permit a tactical retreat. For the soldiers listening to the radio, the classical illusions provided no warmth. They were sacrificed for a broadcast, their deaths required to protect the ego of the high command. Authoritarian regimes hijack ancient myths of noble sacrifice to demand blind obedience and mask the leadership's own strategic failures. In the aftermath of the Second World War, a generation of German writers actively sought to dismantle this toxic propaganda. Author Heinrich Böll wrote a short story titled, with a truncated version of the famous quote, "Stranger, bear word to the Spartans, we. In the story, a young soldier recognizes his old school classroom by the incomplete epitaph on the chalkboard, the severed sentence mirroring his own amputated limbs. Novelist Günter Grass satirized the myth by depicting schoolmasters who mindlessly parroted nationalistic catchphrases to their students, exposing the hollow nature of the regime's indoctrination. Leonidas stood on the front line and died with his men. Modern autocrats sacrifice their citizens from safety to preserve their own power. When leaders invoke ancient glory, they are often demanding a modern sacrifice to cover their own failures. Scrutinizing the myths that drive nations to war remains an urgent necessity.